come to the third presentation of Hermetic America, and we live at the cresting threshold of a complete new time form and a new refinement to the very species which we belong to. And the reason for doing this in a quiet way is because this is a recalibration going back to very ancient origins of civilization and brought forward in waves that are easy to understand. And one of the most profound things is that we are now, for the very first time, reassuming a dimension to our kind that was supposedly tampered with some several thousand years ago. The most powerful prophetic threshold 2,000 years ago was the literature that was grouped around the Book of Enoch. And the Enochian literature eventually came to be 5 parts brought together as the Book of Enoch, and there were supplements, the secret Book of Enoch, and so forth. What it presented was that mankind had been tampered with by aliens. Not so much by UFOs, but by aliens who were watchers of man, who had come to the earth because they fell in love with the daughters of men. And so these angelic beings at home in the heavens came to the earth, and the children they had with terrestrial women were giants. They were more capable than men of this earth and sought to dominate them, not so much by superpower strength like a Superman, but through undermining, through creating currents of an undertow in the way in which men believed and in the way in which men thought of themselves, of each other, and of heaven. And the Enochian literature is quite specific again and again that this was distasteful to God, and that mankind on this planet occupied a very special, not a niche, but a very special acme of divine capacity. The way in which it was stated is that human beings on this planet who are able to recognize their true nature and respond with lives that are legitimate are capable of ascending back into a heavenly reality. And so that Enochian literature, 4 of the 5 parts of the Book of Enoch, were read by the Qumran community and by the Essenes and by many other visionary groups at the time, but the part that was missing was not written yet when an earthquake in 31 BC destroyed the Qumran community. It coincided with the victory of Augustus Caesar over Mark Antony and Cleopatra and formed the basis by which Augustus Caesar founded the Roman Empire very, very quickly after that. The earthquake that struck sent a split in the earth that hit the Qumran community on the shores of the Dead Sea squarely in the baptismal fount, where the steps went down to a baptismal area that was used for purification And the earthquake put an almost diagonal zigzag split in that baptismal fount and destroyed the confidence of the community to continue to live there, and so Qumran was abandoned. About 20 years later, 21 years later, a very special boy was born who grew up to be John the Baptist. And his mother was very old. She was beyond childbearing age. Her name was Elizabeth. And her husband was one of the priests in the temple in Jerusalem. And when he saw an angelic messenger presence that said he is going to have a son, he did not believe it and was struck dumb. He was unable to speak for the 9 months of the pregnancy. And people were absolutely astounded and dazed at what could this mean. And he took to writing on a board. Those of you who remember Mayor Baba, who never spoke or used a board to express himself, John the Baptist's father did this. When the pregnancy had gone 3 months, the old Elizabeth was visited by the youngest kinswoman of her, Mary, who became the mother of Jesus, who was at that time just conceiving the embryonic Jesus. And as soon as the young Mary came into the old Elizabeth's home, the old Elizabeth, who was 6 months pregnant, felt the embryo dance and move in her womb. And this curious resonance was set up. One of the upshots of this is that at that particular time was written the 5th of the books of Enoch, but it occupies the 2nd place in the book of Enoch. It's called the second vision of Enoch. And it's 3 parables, 3 extended parables about 3 qualities that fit together like a triad, and that these 3 concerns, these 3 qualities, like a tripod, found a person who is called the Son of Man. And so that section of the book of Enoch, in the traditional chaptering, it's chapters 37 to 71, they're all about a new quality of man who will not just be man, but will be the Son of Man. And because it is the Son of Man who is capable of ascending back into the heavens, reascending to heaven, fulfills the promise of man as a family member of God. And that this Son of Man will be not only the Son of Man, but be able to achieve the reality of also becoming the Son of God. That section of the book of Enoch was almost certainly written by Joseph, the father of Jesus. Now, Joseph was older than Mary by some years. She married Joseph when she was about 16 and had Jesus when she was 17. This was 9 BC, so she was born about 26 BC. Joseph was born about 40 BC, so that he was about 14 years older than her. And one of the predictions that happened was that in 40 BC, the greatest visionary writer of that time, of that age, Virgil, wrote what has been for 2,000 years called the Messianic Eclogue. And the 3 qualities of that tripod that hold up the Son of Man are the 3 pillars, as it were, to the ancient Hermetic tradition. The Hermetic tradition was the condensation, the distillation of thousands of years of wisdom traditions that literally spread around the entire planet. The pivot for it was Egypt, but the feeding of the angular momentum to that pivot came from Mesopotamia. And it was the Mesopotamia of the Fertile Crescent civilization, founded by Sargon of Akkad about 2350 BC. And commensurate with that founding by Sargon was the refinement of written language so that it could produce for the very first time in history a civilization with a written literature. And the first great writer of the world in written literature was a woman, Sargon's daughter, Enneduanna. She wrote the Inanna epics, and she wrote also a collection of 42 divine hymns. She went to each of the 42 different temple areas of ancient Samaria, but because her father was establishing the Akkadian Empire, the Akkadian civilization, he didn't want to have the old Sumerian divisions of the different temples with their different versions of the gods. He wanted to put them all together in one set. Yes, you have your individual temples, your individual variants of the gods, but all of them belong in a collection which I now make and my daughter writes, and the 42 hymns together, the temple hymns of Enneduanna, is the first time in literature that you have a written harmonic to all the variants of gods in one focus. And that civilization spread its caravans both by land and sometimes by early sea going, from the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean to the Indus civilization in India, the Indus River, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, which at the time were magnificently large cities. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were similar to what one would find if one looked at the province of Alberta in Canada. Calgary and Edmonton have the bulk of the population of the people in two great cities. The Indus civilization had Harappa in the north, like Edmonton, and Mohenjo-Daro in the south, like Calgary. And you had a very coherent kind of civilization. And the wares of the Indus civilization were distributed all through the ancient Near East by the trade routes that were run by Sargon and his family and his fellow civilizing people for this Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent was from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, but the Fertile Crescent had its wider resonances all the way to India and all the way past Cyprus to ancient Crete and the ancient Aegean before the Greeks, before the Dorian Greeks ever arrived in Greece. That early language was a Semitic language. North Semitic, Akkadian, is the world's first written literary language. And it was the language that was used through that wide swath of the ancient world, from India to Greece, focused on Mesopotamia. And it's that language of refinement that what is written now is written in such a way that one can speak from the writing so that that writing will come alive in the spoken moment. And it will be accurate and transmissible through time. From generation to generation, one can trust this writing read right, hears real. In between Sargon and Jesus is about 2,500 years. But time moves in cycles, and one of the cycles, one of the largest Hermetic cycles, is a 2,000-year cycle of 4 seasons, each one lasting 500 years. The season was a cycle of the phoenix. A pair of cycles of the phoenix was a millennium, and a pair of millenniums was the aeon. 2,000 years after Sargon of Akkad comes Alexander the Great. And 2,000 years after Alexander the Great comes Benjamin Franklin. These are makers, establishers of civilization in a wavefront of the aeon. 500 years after Sargon comes Abraham. And if you take a look at the way in which time is delineated in the Gospel of Matthew, right at the very beginning, he talks about how there are 42 generations between Abraham and Jesus, like the 42 temple hymns. Each generation had its own way of talking about the divine. But if you put all of those generations together as a harmonic set, they all fit together as a movement through time of further elaboration that can be brought to a realization. And that realization is transmissible so that lives are transformed out of hearsay, out of a mythic dependence upon opinion or customary belief or authority, to a living word that is realizable and able to be made living in terms of being for all time. The language that Matthew uses is that the 42 generations are divided into 314 generations. The first 14 generation is from Abraham to Solomon, to King David, which is about 1,000 years. It establishes a millennium. Then the next 2 sets of 14 are from Solomon to the coming back from the exile, and from coming back from the exile to Jesus, 2 500-year periods. So that you read Matthew with a Hermetic, Ionic calibration, you understand he's saying this time form has a half a time, and that half has 2 halves as well. So that one learns to see in a composition in terms of the Lord being the Lord of history, that it is the historical movement that is kaleidoscopically capable of bringing out the tripod of the 3 concerns. That tripod can also be called a triad or a trinity. The Hermetic tradition has this as its tripod. It has cosmology, it has alchemy, and it has philosophy. Philosophy is the love of wisdom, the love of Sophia, personified feminine. And that to love her is not to possess her or command her, but to live in an exchange with her that is able to be refined and developed, and a sense of the real comes out of this. It is a dialogue with actuality and sensitivity and refinement. So that philosophy is really a visionary field. The art is the alchemy. It's the art of transformation. not just transformation of metals, lead into gold, but a transformation of minerals as well, but a transformation of plants as well, a transformation of ourselves as well. And so alchemy is the art of transformation. It's about art. As philosophy is about vision, alchemy is about art. And the art must have an artist. There must be someone, a person who does the transforming, who applies the transformation, so that works of art transform. Artists are the makers of the transformation. And they are different from individuals, which center in the mind. And they're different from character, which is the flow of experience, the protagonist of that experience. And they're different in a radical way from the figures who do the acting on a ritual level. And so the art of alchemy is always a reflection of the lensing, jeweled person who is the artist able to do this. So that vision and art are related, but the cosmology is about science. It's about the large cosmos, the study of the cosmos. And the study of the cosmos has its own qualities of analytic, and central to that were a way of taking the structure of the mind through transformation and giving it over to the study of the cosmos in its jewel-like expressive spectrum. We call it differential consciousness. The ancient Hermetic tradition was always that astronomy and harmonics are about the cosmos, and if you bring the structure of the mind, which can be characterized symbolically by geometry and arithmetic, if you bring geometry and arithmetic together with astronomy and harmonics, you get a new square, and that square was called classically the quadrivium. And if you took that square of the quadrivium and brought it into paired play with the triad, now the triad, the triangle, is grammar, the way in which a language gives its expressive structure, dialectic, the mutual using of language between persons, and rhetoric, the way in which one can learn to refine the dialogue that the new grammar sense, constantly improving on just stories, on just mythology, brought into the high art. If you put that triangle with that square, you now have the 7 liberal arts. And the great writer who closed out the classic Hermetic ages was Martianus Capella, who lived in Carthage in the 400s. And the 7 liberal arts were the core of education for the next 1,000 years. But that 1,000 years is known in more olden days, it was called the Dark Ages. Then that was replaced by something less arrogant, and it was called the medieval period. The medieval world is very colorful. It's full of pageant. But it is a rote ritual pageantry that does not change, it does not refine, and increasingly it comes back into a kind of a tribalism that characterized the early attempts at civilization before it was given the Sargon Fertile Crescent expansion, before it was given the Inanna capacity to have harmonic sets of variations that do not contradict each other, they refine each other. And so this jeweled quality of the whole spectrum of humanity became the favorite idea in the revival after the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, the revival of the great learning in the classical time, which itself was the culmination in the Hermetic tradition of thousands of years of wisdom. The most powerful carrier of that idea in the Renaissance was the New World. That there is a whole other half of the world that is like a return to the Garden of Eden. It is primordial. One can go there, and one can go back to the origins of ourselves before we got into the complications, before we got into the rise and fall of things, before we got into settling for a polarizing, tribal-like status quo. And the rediscovery then, by people who went from the Renaissance into the New World, the Renaissance expanded itself to eventually include that the New World was going to have to take a look at the context of history, because it's the living of history, not of myth, that energizes the science, the art, and the vision. And one of the most powerful books of the late Renaissance was written by Sir Walter Raleigh. He was what used to be called a gorgeous man. Festooned, plumed, a Earl Flynn type swashbuckler with great elegance, had the favor of the Queen, Queen Elizabeth, until he fell out of favor, and she did what a queen can do. She said, I'm not going to kill you yet, but you're going to stay and live in the Tower of London. You're not going anywhere else. You're going to be where I can keep track of you. And so in the Tower of London, all those years, Sir Walter Raleigh wrote a history of the world, going back to bring the story of the mythic misunderstandings of people who ended up house arresting people like himself, who was trying to open up the New World. Not only in South America, where he searched for El Dorado, for the golden man who knew the secret of where all the gold of the New World would be, and the organic equivalent to El Dorado, the primordiality of the American Indians, especially in the Jamestown area of what became Virginia. And one of the big crops of Virginia is tobacco, cultivated and raised originally there by those Indians. The Indian who personified the New World was Pocahontas. And Pocahontas went with one of the inheritors of this whole project in Virginia back to England, back to Elizabeth's court, back to London, and she was a knockout. She was, the portraits of her at the time, with all the Elizabethan finery, showed one of the most gorgeous young women you would ever expect to meet. She was not at all a savage. It wasn't about, like, en français, savage. She was primordially beautiful, eloquent and elegant. And it changed the way in which Europeans began to experience the New World, that there was a secret refinement that one could aspire to by going to the New World and becoming a New World person. Not just carrying the Old World and its mythologies and its doctrines to a new place to do more of the same, but to discover something primordial that had been scrambled, that had received stigmatisms all this time, was available for the first time since it happened originally. And one of the qualities of people that inhabited the New World was that there was a chance here for the first time to live ancient lives. This is a recent study on the primitivist dimension in Puritanism. To live ancient lives, to go back to the New World in such a way that you were able to recover the originality, and the originality because it had come to an apex. They didn't know about Sargon. They didn't know about the Fertile Crescent yet. They knew about Alexander the Great. But what they primordially knew about was Jesus, and the early followers of Jesus, before there was a mental structure, before there was a geometry and an arithmetic called Christianity. The earliest way to talk about it was that it was a way, Jesus' way. And so the early American experience was to try to go to a new world to recover the purity of their lives in not primitive Christian communities, but in primordial reality communities. And it was this tone that was emphasized again and again by the failures. I mentioned last week I did a survey a number of decades ago of all the voyages to the New World from Europe. And the tallies of the numbers of people who went. And then the next boatloads would come, and the tallies of the number of people left. More than 90% of the men and women died in the New World. And it became a conviction that one had to leave the old world behind before you went to the New World. You had to purify yourself in the old world so that you were free to go ready for the New World, newly new, to use a phrase that Ben Jonson once wrote about Shakespeare. He said, herein, reader, you will find news that you never knew, and that's why it's news. You will find more wit, perhaps, than you had brain to grind it upon. That was in the first folio of Shakespeare. That quality of purifying oneself before you left the old world so that you could arrive at the new world new was increasingly a concern through the 1600s, through the 17th century. And what made it difficult is that the ways of purifying from the old world were multiple. So that by the time they came purified in their way to get to the new world in their way, there were different districts in the colonies that were convinced that they were really pure and the others were somewhat suspect. The problem for the United States before its inception, before it became the United States, the problem was exemplified in the concerns of Benjamin Franklin. And one of the great biographies of him is A Citizen of the World. He exemplifies not only as a citizen of the world, but a way of understanding that you need to have with your cosmology and with your alchemy and with your philosophy. You need to have a sense of humanity that allows them to found together indeed as science, as art, as vision, but also to have a sense of balance, and the sense of balance in that was humor. The aphoristic wisdom, not the quip, not the wisecrap, but the way in which one can understand humanely that it's not about disagreeing with others so much as laughing together at one's own foibles as well as theirs. That the shared laughter is one of the quickest ways to open people up to the visionary possibilities of loving wisdom, not arguing about it. And instead of arguing to be right, one shared to have a good chuckle, and that this was one of the ancient ways in which men and women are enabled to face and endure what otherwise would characterize itself almost automatically as tragedy. 500 years before Jesus was the development of Greek tragedy, and concomitant with that is the development of Greek comedy. It's about a 3-to-1 portion. Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides and Aristophanes. But it is the poignancy of Aristophanes that humanizes by poking fun even at the gods. One of the great plays of Aristophanes is The Birds, and there are some enterprising Athenians who decide that they're going to make a deal with the birds who fly in the air, who can intercept the smoke of sacrifices so that the smoke of sacrifices don't get to the gods. You don't have to control the gods, just control the supply of praise. They'll have to deal with this, and men will have to deal with this, and we will make a profit both ways. And so Aristophanes has this quality, and of course the gods decide to send a crew of tough guys, Hercules and some other guys, and Aristophanes portrays them as dumb hoods that can't speak the language too good. But we're going to lean on you. And of course the entrepreneurs in Aristophanes say, well, it's the birds. Can you lean on them? There's an awful lot of them, and they fly. Can you fly? You better deal with us. It's the sense of humor in Benjamin Franklin that is the key to the way in which he became world famous. And his world fame initially came into play in 1733 when he published the first issue of Poor Richard's Almanac. And when we come back from the break, we'll take a look at the absolute ingenious telescoping of history and tradition. In Benjamin Franklin, he was in 1733, 27 years old. Let's take a break. Let's come back to the second half of Hermetic America 3. You're looking at the cover of the April 2008 edition of Icarus, which is the International Journal of Solar System Studies. This is volume 194. The point being, this is several hundred pages that comes out every month on solar system studies. We have, for a long time, been living in a new civilization. Now, I've called this new civilization the stellar civilization. And the first time that it was called that by me was in this very room in 1994 in a set of 4 presentations that were put together and published as a book, Our New Aeon, which is being re-edited to reprint, and we'll have it again here. We've always given the Bodhi Tree a world exclusive on this. They've been friends for over 35 years. The stellar civilization has a different base, though it is a refined base from previous civilizations. the deepest core of those civilizations that really worked in the broadest scale were founded initially by Sargon of Akkad about 4,400 years ago. And the transforms of them, the major transform of the Fertile Crescent civilization was 2,000 years later by Alexander the Great. And he understood that what made the Fertile Crescent civilization work is that you had a single language that was doubled up with all the other languages so that you could have an administrative continuity from India to Greece 4,400 years ago. And that language was a North Semitic language that 500 years later gave birth on the Mediterranean coast of what became Phoenicia. It gave birth to two new branches of major world languages. One of them was Hebrew, and the other was the forerunners of Greek. So that at the very origins of the languages used in civilization's sense of Hebrew and Greek, they were cognate variants of Akkadian originally. 1,000 years later, both languages had come to an apex of individual refinement. And the great scholar who pioneered the correlations and the comparative linguistic qualities in literatures was a man named Cyrus H. Gordon. And one of his poignant books was Homer in the Bible. That the language of Homeric Greek is still cognate with a great deal of the intelligence of vision, the art of transform, the historical implications kaleidoscopically of what you were able to write and read in it, and a shared insight into the nature of man in his transcendent capacity. Homer in the Greek, who was it in the Hebrew? The figure in the Hebrew was Solomon. Homer and Solomon, both about 1,000 BC, about 1,000 years after the original variants began to develop. And the most poignant of all of the Solomonic writings, if you take a look in the Old Testament, you will see the book of Proverbs by Solomon and the Song of Solomon, the Song of Songs. If you take a look at the Proverbs of Solomon, he is talking about the way in which the collision with the world toughens you in such a way that you must have a deeper understanding than the conflicts engendered by the world. You must have a way of not only going under them or over them or around them, but of going inside of them. And the Song of Songs is a follow-up to the book of Proverbs. And those two together are very much like the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer. The Iliad is not just about the Trojan War. At the beginning of the Iliad, Homer is, as they used to say, crystal clear. He's world famous for 3,000 years for being clear. He says the Iliad is about the wrath of Achilles. It's about the violent, masculine reaction to the trouble with the world that one gets into, the trouble with other men that one gets into, and that this is about the wrath and the outcome of a masculine violence that does not consult the feminine at all. And the wrath of Achilles is not about the Trojans whom they are fighting. The wrath of Achilles is about a fellow Greek warrior named Agamemnon, King Agamemnon, who took the bedfellow of Achilles, Briseis, for himself. I see what you like in her, she's mine now. And the wrath of Achilles is not to kill Agamemnon, but to not fight. You took her, then you fight. When she's returned to me, I will return to the fight. And by not fighting, the closest male friend to Achilles, Patroclus, is killed because Achilles, all their lives, they have fought together. They trained as young men together. They knew how to vanquish any kind of a fight together. But when Achilles was not there, Patroclus was used to watching his flank, Achilles carrying the action. But Achilles was not there, so Patroclus was put out of shape, bent out of his art of war, and tried to be the center of the fight, and Hector, the great Trojan warrior, killed him. This happens exactly in the center of the Iliad. And like a pebble that is dropped into a pool, the ripples are parallel so that you can have a structure of the Iliad that is perfectly balanced on that event at the center of it. And everything that came before and everything that came after is paired like resonances of a ripple from that event. A masculine violence will insist upon there being a geometrical balance that essentially is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You kill, you die. You steal, you lose the hand. These are the two levels of law in the Sharia. Whereas the sequel, the Odyssey, is all about one of those men, Odysseus, who goes through the gamut of realizations of women. Through Calypso, through Circe, through Nausicaa, through Athena, and finally arrives back in his kingdom to Penelope. And the way to pronounce it, Penelope. She is perfectly balanced in the feminine. She will not accept a masculine balance that does not include her. The balance is between us. And she tells him, you say that you are Odysseus. Yes, I can see, but I don't know if you're the man I married. You've been gone for 20 years. You became a famous killer. You have just killed 105 men in our house because they wanted me for their wife. They were fighting among themselves. And when you came home, look how ferocious you are. You killed all of them. And you involved our young son, Telemachus, in this mass murder. I don't know if you're welcome in my bed. So I will have our marriage bed moved out into the hall, and we'll find out beginning tomorrow. And Odysseus becomes absolutely violent, and then he says, when I married you and built this palace, the first thing I did was to take a live tree and hone it with its roots still in the ground to be the major post of our bed, and built the bedroom around that and the house around that. And now you tell me someone has cut that tree so that you can move our bed into the hall? And it is the breaking point of his violence where he realizes that he was gone for all of the time of the raising of their son. Solomon held together David's kingdom while he was alive, and within a year of his death, the kingdom split into two. The northern part became Israel, the southern part became Judea. They didn't care for each other at all. And by being divided, by being out of unity, not balanced together, there came a man from Mesopotamia who said of himself that he was Sargon II. And he sent his armies in. And the prophet of the northern kingdom, Isaiah, said, we are being given over to Sargon II because the Lord is not happy with how we are. And Israel fell in 722 BC, and the talented men and women were taken by Sargon II to fortify his big burgeoning kingdom. And 130 years later, Nebuchadnezzar, who took over the Sargon II kingdom and made the Neo-Babylonian kingdom, he said, I need more talented men and women to administer my burgeoning empire. They're good at this, these Jews. And so he came and laid siege to Judea and erased the Temple of Solomon. And the exile is a double exile. Once of the split off northern kingdom, and 130 years later, the southern kingdom, Judea. And in that exile, the most outstanding figure in terms of the visionary art of what occurred then is put into two books in the Old Testament. One of them is the book of Ezekiel. The prophet of the fall of the northern kingdom was Isaiah. The prophet of the fall of the southern kingdom was Jeremiah, who was not taken to Mesopotamia. He was taken to Egypt. His people said, we need our prophet. You're coming with us. So he went as a captive to Egypt with those people fleeing. We don't want to be part of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and we're keeping you. But Ezekiel was the prophet, the third prophet in Mesopotamia. And what he saw was a complicated vision. It's truncated as wheels within wheels way up in the air. The spinning of vehicles that are up in the air, and what is up in the air with those wheels within wheels is a complication of whirling fire, and that complication of whirling fire was a visionary premonition of the split initially by someone who wasn't technically a prophet, but was technically a supernatural figure in service of God. His name was Elijah. And Elijah did not die. He was taken up to heaven in a fiery chariot. The wheels of that chariot were parallel for Elijah, but when they were seen by Ezekiel, they were within each other because he was looking up through the axial core. The other book in the Old Testament is the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, out of the 3 parables that are in there, the most powerful is that the 3 friends of Daniel are put into a fiery furnace because they have disappointed the ruler, Belshazzar. And he's going to burn them. And when they looked into the fire, which was made 7 times hotter than it usually is to melt metal, they were unscathed, but there was a 4th figure. And that 4th figure in the book of Daniel is the forerunner vision of Jesus. And that figure is described in the book of Ezekiel as being invisibly at the center of 4 presentations, which turn out later to be the symbols of the 4 Gospels. But that the center was a figure who looked man-like but was burnished as if completely transformed, hair white as wool. And that figuration, those kinds of geometries, that kind of vision reappears in the book of Revelation, in the Apocalypse. And so, haunted was one of the greatest geniuses of all time by what is going on in the book of Daniel, correlate with the book of Ezekiel and the book of Revelation. How do they fit together? They must make some kind of sense. And the figure who worked for 30 years on that problem was Sir Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton. This is a study, 1922, London. Sir Isaac Newton's Daniel and the Apocalypse, with an introductory study of the nature and the cause of unbelief, of miracles, and of prophecy. Professor of Queen's University, Belfast. Newton is extraordinarily famous in his relationship to Benjamin Franklin. This book was published in Philadelphia by the American Philosophical Society, founded by Benjamin Franklin, and it was published in 1966. It's called Franklin and Newton. I.B. Cohen was at Harvard. He founded the History of Science program at Harvard. He is the one who did the Norton Critical Edition of Newton, and he's done a number of books on Benjamin Franklin. The one we've been showing initially, and we'll have more next week, is his great edition done in 1941, Harvard, Benjamin Franklin's Experiments, a new edition of Franklin's Experiments and Observations on Electricity, edited with an introduction, critical and historical. And here's an allegorical print designed by Jean-Henri Fragonard, and it shows Franklin as the hero of the ages. Franklin, who is a citizen of the world, and it's interesting because the pivotal figure of Benjamin Franklin comes exactly 2,000 years after Alexander the Great, who comes exactly 2,000 years after Sargon of Akkad. So that Alexander the Great is, by the time of Benjamin Franklin, he's the center pivot of one older civilization that had ended and a new one was coming into play, which now in Alexander's time was ending and a new one coming into play. And at Franklin's time, that was ending and a new one coming into play. Alexander the Great's word in Greek for our kind was the ecumene, spelled in Latin with an EU, C-U, we get ecumenical, but the Greek is O-I-K-U-M-E-N-E, oikumene. It meant that all mankind is of a single family, that we are more related to each other than we are distinctly different from each other, and the distinct polarizing difference between us is an illusion of individualism, which is an idea in the mind. You are different from me, and what you have, I want. As opposed to, let's share together and have more for all of us. The one is about community. The Greek word is koinonia. It's a community of shared participation, as opposed to a hierarchy where there's one individual at the top and everyone else on a pecking order geometrically below them. So the difference is in between a pyramid structure and a kind of multifaceted, light scintillating jewel. And one of the greatest poems of the 20th century, written by a beautiful Russian poet, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, called Bratsk Station. Bratskaya in Russian is brotherly station. Bratsk Station is a dialogue between the old pyramid structure of authoritarian power and the new Bratsk Station is a hydroelectric station on the great Angara River outside of Irkutsk. And this hydroelectric station turns the energy of the world into electricity, into light. It gives back more light than the energy it takes to make it. It gifts man with the power to do things, to see by, whereas the pyramid was a sign of death for one man, the super ultimate individual, the pharaoh. Two different structures of humanity. Yevtushenko, when he goes into the Bratsk station, when it was finished, he went down the hundreds and hundreds of feet to where the dynamos making electricity were at the bottom of the station, at the bottom of the plunge of the Angara River. And he said the only thing that he heard was the overlaying ripples of the hum of all the electro station dynamos. And he said, they said to me over and over again, everything, 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 everything. That man working together in this way, all things are possible for life. Whereas the old way, the only thing that is possible is for you to service the top one with your death. It's a question not of life and death, it's a question of death and the future. And that the issue that came poignantly in Franklin's time was that the life-death issue is a formulation which is deceiving and misleading, because the issue is not the polarization of life and death. If they threaten your life, they should die. But it's the cooperation for the future. And that future includes all who are still living because they are remembered. And those yet to be born, we're remembering ourselves poignantly for them and passing on this tradition, which is not a mythic tradition, but is a historical matrix out of which they can add, out of which they can select. And that selection then is a new basis for humanity, a new kind of man. We live at a time where that new kind of man, after 300 years, has spread globally. And if we say globally, we fall into a deceit pattern which is inculcated and delusional. It isn't that it's global. It's that it's planetary, and that there is a whole set of planets that are resonant in a harmonic called the star system. And that is a very large structure. Its diameter is about 1 light year. From the furthest reaches of the way in which the star system is balanced magnetically in the interstellar medium. And because it's not statically balanced, it's moving. The entire star system is moving. The entire curl of this whole arm of our galaxy is moving, is whirling. And it is so massive in its whirl that since it was created out of the plasma of interstellar gas, this star system has only rotated 9 times around the pivot of the core of the galaxy. We're still babies in terms of a galactic structure. And this stellar civilization requires a planetary culture that is harmonically expandable to a star system civilization. And within that, the freedom of movement, of gender, of race, of religion, exceeds in every particular issue a political economy that would reduce it to individual polarization and strife. It isn't that war is finished, it's that the idea of war is evaporating. It's not a peace that ends war. It's a future humanity that evaporates the illusion that led to the violence in the first place. And so we live in a particular kind of realm where in the primordiality of the wilds of North America 300 years ago, human beings found that they could be free in such a way that what they thought was purification in the old world still clung like a mist of illusion. And it was only by going into the vastness of North America that they began to realize that it was populated for tens of thousands of years, that the Indians of the Americas have been here for at least 25,000 years and have lived in such a way that it seemed like a wilderness to Europeans when they first came. But if one went into the landscape with a fresh look, with observations that were not presumed, with experiments that were not projected in any kind of expectation, one began to learn that however pure you were from the old world, in the old world, the new world person was never going to be satisfied with being an individual, even a purified so-called individual from the old world. You cannot put new wine into old wineskins. They won't hold, they break, because the new wine has its own expansion. And it will expand the wineskins to the way in which it should be. An artist who is a baker, who wants to make a real French croissant, knows that that dough has to be worked with in an alchemical way. There are times when you knead it. There are times when you let it be, let it rest. There are times when it's partially chilled. There are hundreds and hundreds of times where you refold it. And every refold gives a new molecular layer to the dough, which is not just flour and water, but has butter. That resolving third, the butter, is the way in which each layer, when it is baked, will become flaky and crisp, and yet altogether a beautiful croissant. It's the alchemy of how it is that nutrition is made artistically. It's the difference between a chef and a cook. One of Benjamin Franklin's most famous quotes, God sends meat, the devil sends cooks. They will ruin every piece of meat. I was told that by an army chef who said he was in the Korean War, and he said, you know, we would get these shipments of beautiful prime beef, and then we would have these big kettles and we would cook it until it was gray, so that there would be no bacteria. And there also was no taste. So you're glad to get up from the mess, which was a mess, and go back to fight and maybe have a card game or something. The food gets ruined. The quality of Franklin was that he wanted not to pass it on to a new Franklin, but he wanted to broadcast it in a way that a whole community of newness was bubbling up, bubbling forth. A champagne community. And the champagne is refined from the wine. The wine is already refined from the water, from the grape. It's refined in a transformation called fermentation. But the second refinement is a distillation of what was fermented, and it's that second distillation that makes the third level. It makes the butter. It makes the champagne. It makes the cognac. For 300 years, the experiment has been to keep the bubbles happening and the ferment. And unfortunately, since the Second World War, the United States has more and more slipped back into an empire mentality instead of continuing the observations and the experiment. So that those of us who remember that time of the Second World War, and we are getting fewer and fewer. One of the strange things about being one of the few is you keep getting fewer. Do not remember the changes. The watershed was 1949. And when we get deeply into Hermetic America later in the series, we'll appreciate the incredible events of 1949. In July of 1947, there was a crash of a UFO in Roswell, New Mexico, outside to the northwest. But there was a second crash in 1949, 2 years later. Out of that second crash, instead of there being debris over a wide field, there was a recoverable vehicle and a recoverable entity. that entity was taken to the most secure lab in the world at that time, Los Alamos. When the power structure sent its delegation to witness this entity, the head of that delegation at the time was the Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, the direct emissary of President Truman. They did not understand that the entity was telepathic and powerful because he looked frail, looked small, like a child. And Forrestal's mind, which was honed to a geometric individuality, became terrified at the reality of the situation. And a few months later, he committed suicide running out in the street in Washington, D.C., saying, shouting, yelling, "They're here, they are here." In the meantime, he canceled the United States space program, which at that time had evolved from the V-2s of World War II. In 4 years, they had brought the V-2s as the first stage and put a WAC Corporal rocket on top of it. And in the summer of 1949, that two-stage rocket went 250 miles above the Earth, higher than where the space station is today. It was called the MX program. Forrestal canceled it. Why would you have a space program with rockets when there are things like this? That fear, that polarization, that terror of an incomprehensible history cinched the Cold War in such a way that it dominated for the next third of a century and still is reverberating half a century or more later, almost 60 years later. We live in a situation where we must become planetary as a culture and stellar as a civilization and be free to cooperate over the interstellar frontier. There are not only many different genders and many different races and different religions, there are whole star systems of what Walt Whitman said nature seems to be fond of in Democratic Vistas, written in 1875 for the centennial of the Union. He said, Mother Nature seems to prefer freedom and variation. She likes everyone to be a little bit different, not individually so much, but resonantly in their persons to find out what's going to come out. It isn't the old relic. Before you do something, ask yourself, what if everyone did this? It's called the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant. The existential, non-imperative, is ask yourself, what if no one did this? The universe might be minus a value. Give it a try. Communicate. Let's see. One is creative and memorable. The other is destructive. No future. More next week.